The forest has a language, but it does not speak. It whispers. And this whisper, while it sounds like wind to some ears, touches others like the voice of the past. That morning, when the sun had not yet fully risen, the father and son walking along the old country road in western Vermont had unknowingly followed a whisper. Jack Miller was a 52-year-old man who had never owed anyone much in his life. He was not a showy person, but the lines he wrote on the face of time carried more story than show. This was one of the walks he had taken that morning with his son Daniel. The relationship between them was not tight, but it was not loose either. Or rather, it was as if they had been in a sentence that they had wanted to tell each other many things throughout their lives but had never been able to start. Daniel was 15, quiet. His mind was always somewhere else, but his steps were careful. He would often look at his father, but he would look back ahead with a look that postponed what he wanted to say. When they left the road that morning and entered the forest, the smell of the earth was heavy, like years hidden under wet leaves, silent but alive to the touch. After a few miles, Daniel stopped. "Dad, there's something there." Jack looked up. "What's it like?" Daniel pointed. "The ground is different, like a bulge. The color has changed." Jack leaned forward. When he got down to eye level, he noticed it. A rusty corner was visible among the leaves. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out his knife. They began to dig slowly. First, there was the sound of scraping metal, then a weight, not just physical, like a weight settling on the air. The lid of the box had almost reached the surface. Daniel held his breath. When Jack touched the edge of the box, his fingers trembled slightly. It was as if what he was touching the bones of his own past. The box was 30 by 40. There was no lock on it, but in the middle of the lid were letters that looked like they had been carved by hand. AD 1997. Jack's eyes froze. For a moment, all the sounds around him stopped. Daniel whispered, "1997? What does it remind you of?" Jack didn't answer, but he didn't take his hand off the box. On the contrary, he gripped it even tighter. When they slowly lifted the lid, a musty smell rose up first. Then, a notebook, yellow pages, the edges were burnt, and underneath, a child's beret. Nothing was said for a few seconds. Then Daniel parted his lips. Who could have buried this here? Jack reached for the notebook. The pages hadn't been opened for years. The first page had shaky handwriting, as if the writer was either afraid or in a hurry. I was the last to see it, but no one believed me. Dear viewer, some secrets are buried deep, but sometimes a child's step pulls the past out from under the ground. If you too were to hear the breath of history on a path you took just for a walk, would you turn back, share it with us in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this? Because sometimes the past returns not just to tell stories, but to demand an account. Daniel picked up the notebook. He turned his eyes to his father. What are we going to do? Jack shook his head slowly. We can't close this anymore. Something called us here, and I've been hearing this call for years. Daniel was surprised. Have you been here before? Jack took a deep breath. In 1997, I was on the search team when a child went missing here, but back then, we couldn't find anything. Daniel's eyes widened. So, is this box related to him? Jack looked at the notebook again. There was a name on the next page. Molly Stevens, age 7, missing November 23rd, 1997. That's when Jack fell to his knees. For the first time in years, a face he had tried to forget had returned. And this notebook, it wasn't just a memory, it was a cause. Jack couldn't look at the notebook for long. The yellowed edges of the pages bore the marks not of time, but of fear. The writing was neat at first, but then rushed. There were circular stains of sweat on the edges of the words. This didn't seem like a diary, it seemed like a confession. And at that moment, for the first time in years, Jack felt how heavy the word confession was. Daniel crouched down silently next to him. He saw his father's eyes fill with tears, but he didn't ask, because sometimes a child's greatest instinct is to know when to keep quiet. Jack turned the pages carefully. Each line seemed to piece together the disappearance of a 7-year-old girl named Molly. But this was no ordinary disappearance, because in some lines the author said, "I saw it, but no one listened." In another, "I closed your eyes, but I still hear your voice." "This is testimony," Jack said quietly. Daniel was confused. "What do you mean by testimony? Hadn't the witnesses of the incident already spoken to the police?" Jack shook his head. The case was unsolved. No one in 25 years has given so much detail. Someone hid this writing, maybe because they were afraid. Daniel's eyes went to the notebook. What if the person who wrote it is still alive? Jack had never considered that possibility, but the date on the notebook was only the day after Molly's disappearance. If this writing is really from that date, Jack said, it's not just a testimony, it could be the place where justice is buried. Dear viewer, sometimes a line breaks the silence of a year, but sometimes a child's tear shatters the entire fabric of the past. Have you ever touched a notebook and felt that it wasn't just paper? Share in the comments and subscribe. Because this channel doesn't just bring back events, it brings back forgotten things. Jack carefully put the notebook back in his backpack. Daniel glanced at the other items left in the box: a small hairpin, a rotten boot piece, another black and white photograph. This time, Molly wasn't alone. There was another boy with her. His face was blurry, but something was clear in the background, a clearing that looked like the Vermont woods. When Jack looked at the photo more closely, his knees went weak. Because that place was the path they had walked this morning. This was no coincidence. This was a call to return, and Jack knew it. When they got home that night, Daniel retreated to his room, but Jack opened the notebook. He kept reading. Each sentence caught in his throat. One line was, "I heard her scream for the last time." A hand pulled him. I couldn't run, because if I did, the secret would come out. Jack had been on a volunteer search team in the area during those years. He remembered. They had searched the woods for 3 days when Molly Stevens went missing. But on the third day, strangely, some areas had been designated as unnecessary. Some volunteers had been silenced, some notes were missing. And now, among those silenced, someone had left this notebook. Daniel looked at his father as he descended the stairs. "Are we going to the police?" Jack shook his head. "Not yet. First, we need to find some answers ourselves." The next morning, Jack went to the old town library with the notebook in his hand. He searched the newspaper archives. There were pages of articles in the local newspapers from November 1997 about Molly's disappearance, but what stood out was a column written anonymously. The headline was, "Children don't disappear, they just get silenced." Jack's hands shook. Written underneath was another sentence. "Those who silenced me are still here, but this box will be found one day, because the truth always finds its voice." At that moment, Jack made a decision. He wouldn't hide the notebook, but he wouldn't present it in a mess either. The truth could only produce justice if it was understandable. That night, Daniel and I went back into the forest, but this time they were looking for something else, another box-like thing. Because at the end of the notebook was this note: "This is just the first box, the other one is by the river." Dear viewer, a secret is rarely buried alone. Most of the time, the links of the chain are scattered in different places, and sometimes someone dares to pull this chain one by one. Have you ever faced your own story while searching for the rest of a secret? Tell me in the comments, and stay tuned. Because when a secret begins to be solved, silence can no longer return. Jack and Daniel found the river in the dim light of their flashlights. There was a recess between the rocks on the shore, and there, another box. This time, Jack didn't hesitate. He reached out. But when he touched the box, something happened. A sound echoed. Not the snapping of a dry branch, a footstep. Daniel turned around in panic. Jack put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Stop!" A shadow appeared from the trees, a tall, thin figure. His face was invisible, but his hands were in his pockets, and his voice, unfamiliar but echoing in the darkness like a warning. "Who let you find that box?" The man's voice seemed to have come from the forest trunk. It was harsh but cracked, like someone who had once spoken loudly, then fallen silent in fear of his own voice. "Who made you find that box?" he had said. But he already knew the answer to that question. When Jack's eyes focused on the man's face emerging from the darkness, something stirred inside him in a way he didn't want to remember. The man was unfamiliar, but those eyes that had once been squeezed shut in fear, then opened again, and nothing was the same again. The man kept walking. His hands were in his pockets, but his walk was not threatening. As he approached, Daniel's steps slowed. Jack took his son's arm. "Stay." His voice was not fatherly harsh, more like a request hidden in a gentle command. Daniel stopped, but he didn't take his eyes off the man, because sometimes a child senses something unsaid in the faces of adults, and now Daniel didn't want to sense it, he wanted to know. The man stopped. "My name is Eli," he said. "Eli Carton." Another silence ensued. The rocks on the riverbank seemed to shift to hear that name. "I was there the day that child, Molly, disappeared." Jack's throat went dry. It was easy to speak, but when some words were on the tip of the tongue, even the tongue would pull back. "I don't remember you," he said finally. "I was there that day. I was on the search party. There were hundreds of people, but you?" Eli didn't look away. "Because I kept quiet." That silence was such that you couldn't hear Daniel's breathing or Jack's heartbeat. Only the sound of water hitting the rocks carved the truth between them a little deeper. "I was scared," Eli said. "I was the last person to see her, and then everything went black." Jack's face tightened. "What do you mean went black? What did you see in the woods that day?" Eli took a step closer. He pulled a crumpled photograph from his jacket pocket. It was a small photograph of Molly, but the back was written, "I wasn't going to let go of her hand." Jack watched Eli's trembling fingers. As if he had memorized the sentence, the man whispered, "I took her hand. Then I let go. I was scared because that man had come to us. He was like one of us. He had a badge on his jacket." Jack's face went blank at that moment. "A badge?" Eli shook his head. "He was one of the council, one of the city's elders. I had seen him at many meetings over the years, but that day, he was a monster." Tears welled up in his eyes. "Molly didn't want to go with him. She backed away. I couldn't say anything. I just looked." Jack's knees buckled. "Was his name Mark Selden?" Eli bowed his head. "You know it." The tears that fell from Eli's eyes surprised Daniel, because an adult's crying echoes deeply in a child's inner world. Daniel turned to his father. "Have you ever said that name before?" Jack's voice came from deep within him. "Number. But I know him. Everyone respected him back then. But something always seemed wrong inside me. His tone of voice, his look, his smile." Eli showed another box. "I buried that box here out of fear of him, because I ignored Molly's voice for years. Dear viewer, sometimes the truth doesn't rot away underground. It waits. It only waits for someone brave enough. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt like you heard the voice they've been collecting inside for years? Write in the comments. Subscribe. Because this channel tells not only about voices, but also about the screams that echo inside." Jack fell to his knees. He watched the river. "I was silent too," he said, "but in a different way. I didn't see anything, but I always felt like something was missing inside me, because that day, the file was closed very quickly. The council said, 'Searched, not found,' and it was over." Eli looked at Jack. "But you came with your son. This means the end of your silence." Daniel leaned in as well, "And the beginning of my story." Jack touched his son's shoulder. There were 25 years in that touch. silence, regret, but most of all, not too late. That night, they returned to town with the boxes and the notebook. Jack and Eli went to the police station. Statements were given. The notebook was taken as evidence. Names were given. Photographs were presented. 3 weeks later, Mark Selden, who had been living under a false identity in Florida, was arrested. DNA matches confirmed his traces on one of Molly's belongings. The incident was reported in the press. The 25-year-old case was reopened. The headlines read, "The silence is broken." But for Jack, this was not just a headline. It was the breaking of a burden. As Daniel left school, he read the notification on his phone. Mark Selden has been caught. Tears welled up in his eyes. He crouched down. Then he took a deep breath. Because some justice is not only served in courtrooms, it is also served in a child's inner world. A month later, Molly's family came to town. For them, this was a case that needed to be closed but could never be forgotten. Jack stood at the monument. His hand was there, so was Daniel. All three of them stood silently, but as if they had stood at 3 different times with the same pain. Another box was buried under the monument. This time there was only a notebook inside and a single sentence. Silence is not a crime, but speaking so as not to silence is courage itself. Dear viewer, thank you for watching this story. If one day you too become a silent person, remember, even a single sentence within you can save another story. Leave your own sentences in the comments and subscribe. Because we don't just tell stories here, we remind people.